Hello and welcome to In Control, the first podcast on control theory. Here we discuss the science of feedback, decision-making, artificial intelligence, and much more. I'm your host, Alberto Padoan, live from a recording studio in Vancouver. Yes, you heard that correctly. I'm now based in Vancouver. Well, small life update. I've recently started as an assistant professor at UBC, University of British Columbia. So if you're considering grad school, feel free to check my website for open positions. I'd love to hear from you. As always, a big thanks to our sponsors, the National Centre of Competence in Research on Dependable Ubiquitous Automation, the International Federation of Automatic Control, and the IEEE Control Systems Society for their continued support. Today, we're exploring the life and legacy of one of the 20th century's most influential mathematicians, Richard Bellman. Best known for creating dynamic programming, Bellman's impact goes far beyond that. His ideas reshaped optimization and decision-making, introducing concepts like the curse of dimensionality, the Bellman equation, the Gromval-Bellman inequality, and the Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equations, among others, all of which continue to influence fields ranging from control theory to artificial intelligence. But Bellman's story can be summed up by his mathematical contributions alone. From optimizing missile trajectories during the Cold War to laying the groundwork for modern AI, his work left a profound mark on nearly every domain where mathematics meets real-world complexity, resulting in more than 600 technical papers and 40 books. Consequently, this episode can only scratch the surface of his achievements. Bellman seemed to live multiple lives, producing a staggering body of work across mathematics, biology, and beyond. And so to do his legacy justice, I'll often quote directly from his autobiography, Eye of the Hurricane, a brilliant, witty memoir filled with sharp insights, surprising anecdotes, and a touch of self-deprecating humor that really captures the spirit of the man. If you haven't read it, I really highly recommend it. So today's episode isn't just about his technical milestones, but it's about his mindset, his resilience, creativity, and unrelenting curiosity. So settle in and let's dive into the remarkable life of Richard Bellman, a true pioneer who taught us how to think. Richard Ernest Bellman was born on August 26 in 1920 in Brooklyn, New York, to Jewish immigrant parents. His upbringing was modest, but intellectually vibrant, immersed in the cultural dynamism of early 20th century Brooklyn. Reflecting on his childhood, Bellman described the city in 1920s and 1930s as an exhilarating place to grow up, filled with ideas and arguments. His father immigrated from the Kiev region, but the family name had a more complex and curious origin. Bellman recounts in his autobiography the following. The name Bellman is Swedish. We know historically that the Swedes went down as far as Kiev. Whenever I go to Stockholm, I have some fun. The name, quote-unquote, Bellman in Sweden is like Shakespeare in the United States. Carl Michael Bellman was a very famous Swedish poet, and there are many places and dishes named after him. As a matter of fact, people in Sweden usually think I'm joking when I use the name Bellman. Though raised in a culturally Jewish household, Bellman described his upbringing as largely secular, noting that, quote, the only one in the family who had any religion was my grandmother, end of quote. His own views on faith were shaped by a rationalist perspective, which he illustrated with a quote he admired from mathematician Lagrange. When asked by Napoleon if he believed in God, Lagrange famously replied, "Sire, I have no need of that hypothesis." Bellman was left-handed, and when he entered public school, he was forced to learn to write with his right hand. After starting to stutter, teachers left him the use of the left. According to him, and I quote, "I also believe that there is strong correlation between left-handedness and creativity. Being left-handed in a right-handed world, one is constantly forced to examine every situation carefully. Nothing can be taken for granted. One gets used to looking at the world with fresh eyes." His teenage years were marked by personal challenges. Both of his parents unfortunately fell seriously ill around the same time. His father when Bellman was 15 and his mother a year later. He recalled, "For a long while, one was in hospital and one was in another. Consequently, I used to visit one on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and the other on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. On Sunday, I would visit them both. Since I was an only child, this made me quite used to being alone." Yet, despite these hardships, Bellman himself describes his youth as a happy time. He felt deeply loved, surrounded by people who listened to his ideas, and he thrived both intellectually and physically, excelling as an athlete. Richard Bellman's fascination with mathematics began early, driven by an innate curiosity about patterns and structure. Yet, he wasn't a stereotypical child prodigy. As he described it, he was, and I quote, "a restless student who found structure not in discipline but in ideas." This intellectual restlessness, combined with an aversion of rigid learning, would define his career. It is interesting to note that mathematics was not Bellman's first academic love. His art was initially set on theoretical physics. He wanted to study relativity. Reflecting on his early ambitions, he wrote, and I quote again from his autobiography, "At that time, I thought mathematics was only useful for theoretical physics." Despite this narrow view of mathematics, his natural talent was undeniable. He discovered the use of determinants on his own at high school, well before formal instruction. When he graduated from Abraham Lincoln High School, he was awarded medals in mathematics, English, history, and Latin, a testament to his wide-ranging intellectual curiosity. His interests were remarkably different, from competing on the math team to excelling in Latin, creative writing, and sports, including tennis, for example. He was a voracious reader. Bellman devoured works from Montaigne to Mark Twain. He was particularly influenced by the philosophy of Niels Henrik Abel, adopting the mathematician's dictum, "Read the masters, not the pupils." This emphasis on foundational thinkers rather than second-hand interpretations would shape his learning philosophy throughout life. After graduating from high school, Bellman enrolled at Brooklyn College, still with the intent on becoming a theoretical physicist. However, a pivotal experience shifted his path toward pure mathematics. He recalled a funny moment during a mechanics course, and I quote, "I'll never forget that the instructor in mechanics looked over the write-up of the experiments in electronics and asked me how the results compared with the theory. Of course, I didn't have the slightest idea. However, I said without battling an eye, 'Within the limits of experimental error.' Fortunately, that satisfied him, and he asked no further questions. It was clear that I was not to be a theoretical physicist. Consequently, with a sigh, I decided to stay a major in mathematics, and that is how I became a mathematician." His mathematical ability was evident early on, even leading to some humorous classroom defiance. Bellman shared this story from a modern geometry course. Roger Johnson also wrote an excellent book on modern geometry. Unfortunately, when that course was given, he was not the instructor. The instructor was an ass who knew very little geometry. Consequently, I did not bother to go to class. Instead, I went to our table in the cafeteria, leaving instructions that if we got stuck, he could call me. From time to time, some student would come down to get me. Then I would go to the classroom, find out what the difficulty was, show him how to get around it, and return to the cafeteria. Yet, beneath this blend of brilliance and irreverence lay personal struggles. His late teens were marked by profound loss. His mother fell seriously ill during this final year of high school and died when he was just 18. Her death, though expected, left a complex emotional void. Bellman confesses in his autobiography, "I remember reproaching myself that I was not more touched by her death." Her passing also fractured his family, as Bellman explains. "My grandfather had never liked my father. When my mother died, he felt this was a good excuse to sever relations. Naturally, this made things awkward for me. One of the minor consequences of this schism was that I had to eat 2 huge Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners. This was just a strain, even for me. Despite the personal hardships, Bellman's intellectual curiosity never wavered. His early struggles and diverse influences would not only shape his mathematical career, but also his unconventional, often humorous approach to life and learning. Richard Bellman graduated from Brooklyn College in June 1941 and immediately began graduate studies at Johns Hopkins University that fall, a time he would later describe as, and I quote, "not a good time to begin anything, with global conflict on the horizon." Upon sharing his plans to attend Johns Hopkins, he often received the same puzzled reaction. "So, you're going to be a doctor?" Initially, he would correct the assumption, patiently explaining that Johns Hopkins was a university with many departments and that his goal was to become a mathematician. But as he recounts with characteristic humor in his autobiography, after a while, I just said yes. Johns Hopkins had a strong mathematical department, with influential figures like Oskar Zariski, a pioneer in algebraic geometry, among the faculty. Still, Bellman's academic journey soon took a dramatic turn. During this time, Bellman sequentially dated several women, but eventually settled on Betty Jo. Initially, he had planned to marry her after completion of his PhD, but as global tensions escalated, they chose not to wait. From his autobiography. "The uncertainties of the world situation were such that we decided to get married then and there," he wrote. On November 22, 1941, Bellman, aged 21, and Betty Jo, just 18, decided to get married. As he reflects in his autobiography, clearly we were both too young. Only a few weeks later, while visiting his father in New York, history interrupted their plans. As they listened to classical music on radio, the broadcast was suddenly interrupted by the familiar voice of Kaltenborn saying, "The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor." With the United States entering the war, Bellman felt that he had to leave Johns Hopkins and, under the suggestion of his aunt Sylvia, took a position at Belleville, Illinois, as an instructor in electronics for military personnel. Though unplanned, Bellman found satisfaction in teaching electronics. "I enjoyed electronics. The subject had a clearness and elegance about it that appealed to my mathematical soul." Yet, it also introduced him to a new way of thinking, the concept of approximation. And I quote again, "In studying electronics, I learned that various laws were only approximate. This was a new idea. Presumably my instructors in high school and college had pointed this out, but I certainly did not hear it." By June, when Betty Jo completed her semester at Brooklyn College, she joined him in Belleville. As the Air Force expanded its technical training, Bellman was offered a choice of relocation sites: Chicago, Madison, Wisconsin, or Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Madison was the clear choice for both personal and professional reasons. Not only would it offer the resources of the University of Wisconsin, but Betty Jo could finish her senior year there. By then, Bellman had grown fond of small towns, as he says. "When I left New York for Baltimore, I thought I was leaving the hub of the universe. By the time I had spent 6 months in Belleville, I had no desire to return to New York, or to Chicago for that matter." Madison marked a period of intellectual growth, but also came with humorous episodes that showcased Bellman's quirky side. In one memorable incident, Bellman fell asleep after using the shared plumbing in their rooming house. Hours later, his wife burst into the room in tears, exclaiming, "What have you done?" Apparently, the toilet had overflowed, soaking the entire second floor and discoloring the wallpaper on the ceiling below. Bellman later joked, "We paid for the wallpaper, and I promised faithfully that I would not eat prunes, and we were all allowed to stay." Afterward, he refused to use the rooming house bathroom and saved his business for Trofield. However, he still shaved there, leading to another legendary mishap with ancient gas water heater. Attempting to save time, Bellman lit both gas burners at once. There was a loud explosion, and I was hurled against one side of the bathroom. Meanwhile, there was a big hole in the ceiling where the gas heater had disappeared. I had launched the first space missile. Despite the chaos, Madison was a turning point in Bellman's career. He began exploring serious research problems, often browsing journals for inspiration. As he says in the autobiography, my procedure was simple. I would thumb through the latest issue of the Duke Mathematical Journal or the Bulletin of the American Mathematical Society and see whether there was something interesting I wanted to do. One such moment occurred when he encountered the paper on stability. And I quote again, I was able very easily to convert the problem into a problem involving an inequality. At this point, I was very discouraged. All my previous experience with inequalities had been that they produce nothing useful. You can imagine how surprised I was to find that this one actually yielded something worthwhile. This result became the famous Bellman-Grunwald inequality, a cornerstone in the analysis of differential equations. For those who have not seen it before, the inequality provides an upper bound on how a non-negative quantity evolves over time under the influence of both its current state and external factors. The initial condition, if you wish. It's widely used in stability analysis, ensuring that small disturbances or small perturbations in the initial conditions don't lead to uncontrolled system behavior. In 1941, Bellman received an unexpected call from Solomon Lefschetz, a renowned topologist and head of the Princeton mathematics department. Lefschetz offered him the opportunity to become a graduate student under his supervision. However, Bellman declined due to fears of being drafted into the military. But Lefschetz, persistent and influential, arranged a creative solution, offering Bellman a role as an instructor for an Army specialized training program, a position that would shield him from conscription while allowing him to continue his studies. Bellman accepted, and he and Betty Jo relocated to Princeton. This marked in 1941. This marked the beginning of Bellman's deeper immersion into pure mathematics, and his mentorship under one of the giants of the field, setting the stage for his groundbreaking work on dynamic programming that would follow. Richard Bellman's graduate studies at Princeton placed him under the mentorship of Solomon Lefschetz, a towering figure in topology. Lefschetz's influence on American mathematics was profound, though his life often doesn't receive the full depth it deserves. I'll give you just a glimpse of Lefschetz's life before moving on with Richard Bellman's life. Born in Moscow, 1884, to a family of Jewish traders who traveled across Europe and the Middle East, Lefschetz held Ottoman passports but grew up in Paris. Actually, I could not tell from the autobiography and Wikipedia and other sources where Lefschetz was born. According to Bellman, he was born in Iran. According to online sources, Lefschetz was born in Russia. I would be curious to know if any in the audience actually knows where Lefschetz originally was born. Anyways, since he was not a French citizen, a career in mathematics seemed impossible. He turned instead to engineering, drawn to the subject because it heavily relied on mathematical tools. After graduating, Lefschetz moved to the United States for practical experience, but suffered a life-changing accident early in his career. While working as an electrical engineer apprentice, he lost both hands and most of his forearms in a transformer testing accident. His hands were replaced by wooden prosthetics, yet this profound disability did not deter him. Dissatisfied with the repetitive nature of engineering work, Lefschetz shifted towards pure mathematics, earning a fellowship at Clark University. The mathematics department was small, with only 3 professors. Yet, Lefschetz excelled, completing groundbreaking work on algebraic surfaces and fixed-point theorems. His results earned him a faculty position first at the University of Nebraska and later the University of Kansas, where his foundational work in topology began gaining attention. Eventually, Princeton invited him as a young visiting professor, a role that became permanent as he pioneered many ideas in algebraic topology. During World War II, Lefschetz shifted his focus from pure mathematics towards differential equations and control theory, hoping to contribute to the war effort. Later in his career, after the launch of Sputnik, he became deeply concerned about America's mathematical preparedness for space exploration. This led him to establish a research institute dedicated to nonlinear differential equations. Lefschetz was a demanding mentor, but he profoundly shaped Bellman's development. Though primarily a pure mathematician, Lefschetz inspired Bellman to balance rigor with problem solving. And Bellman later reflected, Lefschetz taught me rigor, but the real world taught me urgency. Going back to Bellman's journey, Bellman's academic journey was interrupted by World War II. After a brief assignment working on sonar applications in San Diego in 1944, he was finally drafted into the US Army in December of that year. His scientific skills quickly led him to a posting at Los Alamos in 1945, where he contributed to critical research related to the Manhattan Project. At Los Alamos, Bellman was immersed in a culture of secrecy and high-stakes science. He described how compartmentalized was the research there and strictly enforced. Different researchers did not talk about projects with others unless they were working on the same project. The limited computational tools available left a strong impression on him, as he says in the autobiography. In those days, differential equations were solved by using desk calculators. A great deal of arithmetic was involved, done on large sheets of paper with various self-correcting results. At least 2 people would do the same calculation and compare results every 15 minutes or so. Though Los Alamos had one of the earliest digital computers, it was notoriously unreliable. There was a digital computer reputed to be able to solve 10 simultaneous differential equations. However, it broke down all the time and probably had very little storage. Consequently, it was not used much, and I've never even saw it. Bellman worked alongside many remarkable figures, including Niels Bohr, Enrico Fermi, and Peter Lux, among others. Yet, the environment was so compartmentalized that collaboration was limited. Still, the experience profoundly shaped his mathematical philosophy, emphasizing the need for practical tools and not just theoretical elegance. The scientific intensity at Los Alamos was matched by complex ethical questions. Bellman recalled an encounter with the renowned mathematician Paul Erdős, who wished to join the project but refused to sign a loyalty oath, preventing him from discussing the atomic bomb after the war. As Bellman says in the autobiography, considering all the foreign scientists at Los Alamos, such a paper was a farce. Erdős was ultimately excluded from the project. Bellman reflected deeply on the moral complexities of the work. We had read of the concentration camps and the extermination program for Jews, Russians, Poles, Gypsies, and others, and we knew what an evil thing Nazism was. We also knew that the Nazis were working on a bomb like this with the aid of several eminent scientists, such as Heisenberg. It was a race against the Nazis. By 1946, with the war concluded, Bellman was eager to return to academia and resume his mathematical studies. At the time, rumors circulated that soldiers could be discharged early if they had an academic invitation secured. At this point, Salomon Bochner, yes, the same Bochner behind the Bochner integral and significant contributions to harmonic analysis and probability theory, Bellman managed to get that invitation. Bochner, recognizing Bellman's talent, arranged for him to receive a prestigious National Research Fellowship at Princeton. However, the path to academic life was not without its hurdles. Bureaucracy, it seems, had other plans. Bellman recalled the ordeal with his signature dry humor. Much to my surprise, the rumor was true. It was necessary to fill out an application which naturally was lost. The army clerks would not let me fill out another and insisted on finding the original, which they did, after several weeks of anguish. He was officially discharged from the army on March 1st, 1946, a date he celebrated for the next decade. He was also eager to get back to research and earn his PhD. And I quote again, "I went immediately to Princeton. I should have taken a vacation for at least 3 months, but I was anxious to make up for the lost time." By 1946, with the war over, Bellman returned to Princeton under a National Research Council pre-doctoral fellowship, which was initially awarded for 1 year but automatically renewed for a second. In addition to his fellowship, he taught a class bringing his total earnings as a graduate student to $3,000 a year, a substantial amount for the time. Yet, despite the financial comfort, Bellman was eager to move forward. "I was tired to be a peon. I wanted to be my own master. Consequently, I wanted to get my degree as soon as possible. He had initially intended to work with Solomon Bochner, a leading figure in analysis, as we mentioned before, whose lectures on ergodic theory Bellman praised as a beautiful result which can seldom be used. The necessary conditions are virtually impossible to establish. However, Solomon Lefschetz, his formal advisor and a dominant figure in Princeton's mathematics department, persuaded him to write up his results on stability theory instead. Bellman later described his thesis focus as follows. Stability theory is the study of systems under various perturbing influences. Since there are many systems, many types of influences, and many equations describing systems, this is an open-ended problem. A system is designed so that it will be stable under external influences. However, one cannot predict all external influences, nor the magnitude of those that occur. Consequently, we need control theory. By June 1946, in only 3 months, Bellman successfully completed his PhD, a milestone he described bluntly as, "My plan was very simple. I wanted to get my PhD, the union card, quote-unquote, and then work on analytic number theory with Siegel." But fate had other plans. To provide some context, Carl Ludwig Siegel was a towering figure in number theory, renowned for his work on Diophantine equations and celestial mechanics. He was at the Institute for Advanced Study during Bellman's time at Princeton. Bellman was eager to explore number theory, one of his passions since his high school studies. He had approached Siegel and convinced him to give lectures on transcendental numbers. Siegel agreed, but under the condition that Bellman guaranteed an audience of at least 6 people, which turned out to be a difficult feat. In any case, Bellman managed, and the collaboration soon spiraled into an unfortunate academic controversy. Princeton University Press was keen to publish a book from Siegel and Bellman, alongside Schiffman and Gordon Paul. So Bellman was tasked with transcribing and editing Siegel's lectures into a manuscript. As the process unfolded, both Schiffman and Paul dropped out, leaving Bellman solely responsible for completing the work while juggling also his thesis. Despite the mounting challenges, Bellman pressed on, determined to finish the manuscript. However, disaster struck when Siegel objected strongly to Bellman's notation, going so far as to demand the entire print run to be suppressed. Bellman recounted the drama very vividly in his autobiography. It was a beautiful October day. My first premonition of disaster was Lefschetz, waggling a wooden finger at me and saying, "Dicky boy, you're really into the soup now." He went off chuckling merrily. Then Tucker looked at me sorrowfully, and I wondered what I had done. Emil Artin, another leading mathematician at Princeton, pulled Bellman aside, insisting that he apologize directly to Siegel. Bellman was more than willing, but couldn't locate Siegel at the time. Copies of the book had already been sent to major libraries, forcing the press to absorb the loss. Though Bellman even offered to personally cover the $300 printing cost, the damage was done. Siegel later rewrote the book himself, published as number 18 of the Annals of Mathematics Studies, with Bellman referring to the earlier version as the limited edition, quote-unquote. The incident created deep divisions in the mathematical community. Curran, who was a close friend of Siegel, sided against Bellman, while others, like Otto Neugebauer, supported him, saying, though, "Let Siegel write his own books." Despite the setback, Bellman remained productive. His thesis on stability theory became foundational to his later thinking in control theory. Around this time, he collaborated with Joe LaSalle, an office mate at Princeton, who would later become famous for the LaSalle invariance principle in stability theory. Together, they explored differential equations and nonlinear systems, including control-theoretic questions like the bang-bang control problem. Bellman's time at Princeton was also marked by encounters with some of the greatest minds of the 20th century. His Sunday visit to the Institute for Advanced Study allowed him to meet Norbert Wiener, though their friendship wouldn't fully develop until years later. He also crossed paths with mathematicians like Atle Selberg, known for his sieve method in number theory, and the ever-elusive Paul Erdős, who Bellman described as the nearest thing to an ergodic particle that a human being could be. Another figure who left a lasting impression was Albert Einstein. Bellman recounted a failed attempt to meet him, which became one of his more amusing anecdotes. After arranging with physicist Anne Strauss to join Einstein's daily walk with Kurt Gödel, a misunderstanding with the secretary caused Bellman to miss the meeting. Upon discovering that Bellman was absent, Einstein reportedly searched the entire institute building and wondering aloud, "Why doesn't he like me? Everyone else wants to meet me, and he doesn't." The fallout embarrassed Bellman so much that he never attempted to meet Einstein again, despite frequently seeing him from a distance at public lectures. Following his PhD, Bellman briefly engaged in political activism, aligning with the Progressive Citizens of America and supporting Henry Wallace's presidential campaign, believing that Truman was too conservative. However, this involvement was short-lived. Professionally, Bellman began feeling restless. Despite securing a permanent assistant professorship at Princeton, the intellectual pressure was intense. He later reflected, "I felt that Princeton was not a good place for a young mathematician. I wanted to work on problems which had a high probability of remaining unsolved. There was too much pressure that came from the institute, where there were many fine mathematicians, and the pressure was overwhelming." Ultimately, he sought a change, and this change materialized when Gabor Szego, chair of the mathematics department at Stanford and uncle-in-law of Peter Lux, offered Bellman an assistant professorship. He initially declined since he already held the same rank at Princeton, so Szego returned with an offer for an associate professorship, which Bellman accepted at the age of 28, making $5,000 a year. Lefschetz, Tucker, and other Princeton colleagues were dismayed by his departure, considering it a professional misstep. Yet, Bellman was firm in his decision, craving intellectual freedom and a less pressurized environment, saying, "I knew this would hurt Lefschetz a great deal, and I was very unhappy about this. However, I felt it was the right thing to do." After leaving Princeton, Bellman joined RAND Corporation for the summer of 1948, a decision partly influenced by his strained relationship with Solomon Lefschetz. Bellman says in the autobiography, "Since I knew Lefschetz was angry and hurt at my leaving Princeton, I was not surprised when he refused to support me through the summer. Seeking independence and new challenges, Bellman found himself drawn to RAND's unique intellectual environment. At the time, RAND was transitioning from a military think tank to a permanent institution dedicated to high-level research. Originally part of the Douglas Aircraft Company, it had been a brainchild of General Hap Arnold, who believed the Air Force needed not only technological but also strategic insights for global operations. Bellman described the transformation of RAND with his usual dry humor. RAND is an acronym standing for Research and New Development. A common joke was that it was really standing for Research and No Development. RAND formally became an independent entity through a $300,000 loan secured from San Francisco banks, which helped establish a $1 million line of credit. Later, the Ford Foundation provided a $1 million loan to the fund to fund the construction of a permanent building, which was later forgiven on the condition that the funds would be spent on research in the public interest. Bellman compared RAND's structure to a university with specialized divisions for mathematics, physics, engineering, and social sciences. However, he noted that there was as much politics at RAND as at a university. RAND attracted some of the brightest minds of the era across multiple fields. The mathematics division alone included George Brown, well known for game theory, Ted Harris, known in the theory of stochastic processes, Lloyd Shapley, also a game theorist and then Nobel laureate in economics, John Tukey, statistician and co-inventor of the fast Fourier transform, and George Dantzig, the father of linear programming and the simplex method. Other departments were equally distinguished, including figures like Herman Kahn, nuclear strategy, Dick Latter, physics, and prominent social scientists and philosophers such as Herbert Goldhammer and Abraham Kaplan. Bellman was particularly captivated by Dantzig's work on linear programming, especially the simplex method for solving large-scale optimization problems, as he says in the autobiography. This was my first exposure to effective numerical solutions, which subsequently became a central theme of my research. Rand's culture blended serious research with intellectual play. Bellman had always been fond of chess, and with his colleagues at Rand frequently played Kriegspiel, a variant of blindfold chess where players could only see their own pieces and relied on a referee for partial information about their opponent's moves. Bellman described it as a game that combines the logic of chess with the uncertainty of poker. Interestingly, expertise in standard chess often didn't translate to skill in Kriegspiel. As he says, in fact, there was usually a negative correlation. One of Rand's primary mathematical focuses was game theory, heavily influenced by John von Neumann, who occasionally visited. Bellman described the atmosphere as follows. The main mathematical activity of the mathematics division was the theory of games, under the influence of von Neumann, who visited from time to time. This is a mathematical theory of competition, and one expected it to be quite useful for the Air Force. Von Neumann's minimax theorem, which formalized optimal strategies for zero-sum games, was central to the work. However, Bellman noted its practical limitations. In reality, competitors are not always in complete opposition. Often, they don't even share the same objectives. This inspired Bellman's early work on multi-stage games with Joe LaSalle and games of protocol with Markey, expanding game theory into dynamic settings where decisions unfold over time and are not made simultaneously. Bellman began grappling with the challenges of modeling complex systems during his time at Rand. He reflected on the delicate balance required in mathematical modeling. If the model is too small, a great deal of analysis and numerical solution can be done, but the results may be meaningless. If the model is too large, neither analysis nor numerical solution can be carried out, and interpretation becomes difficult. This tension between mathematical tractability and real-world complexity would inspire his later work on dynamic programming, which we're going to talk about very soon. Among Bellman's early collaborations at Rand was his work with Ted Harris on stochastic branching processes. Together, they explored how a single particle could split into multiple particles of similar or different types, a model that turned out to be useful in understanding mutation patterns and cancer progression. Ted and I were very interested in the cancer problem, Bellman says in the autobiography, but we were aware of the complexity of physiological processes. Our work led us to study branching processes as a mathematical model of mutation. Despite his growing stature at Rand, Bellman remained characteristically self-deprecating about his personal challenges, including his first attempt to get a driver's license. The episode is recounted in the autobiography as follows. I finally took my driving test, which I failed. I had no difficulty driving, but parking was another matter. I ended up perpendicular to the curb. I had the ignominy of having to ship the car to Stanford and take the train instead. It was at Rand that Bellman would develop his most famous contribution, dynamic programming. Frustrated by the computational limitation of the time and inspired by Danzig's simplex method, he began exploring how complex multi-stage decision problems could be broken down into smaller, manageable subproblems. But this would not come until the next summer. By the late 1940s, Richard Bellman had joined Stanford alongside Max Schiffman, and the two shared both a close friendship and a determination to modernize the university's mathematics curriculum. Bellman recounts this period in the autobiography as follows. Max and I came to Stanford at the same time, and we had great plans. On many long walks, we discussed these plans and much mathematics. Schiffman, a powerful mathematician and a Rand consultant, collaborated with Bellman on work involving the Neyman-Person lemma, a fundamental result in statistical hypothesis testing. Bellman admired Schiffman's proof of the min-max theorem, describing it as an elegant contribution to optimization theory, adding, his proof should be better known, and someday I intend to include it in a book. However, their push for modernization was met with resistance from the department chair Gabor Szego. Bellman described how Szego saw him and Schiffman as disruptive influences, resistant to their proposed curriculum reforms. When both were recommended for the editorial board of the newly formed Pacific Journal of Mathematics, Szego blocked their appointments. Bellman was also frustrated by the outdated state of Stanford's graduate offerings compared to Princeton or NYU, describing the curriculum as elementary school by comparison. He and Schiffman took it upon themselves to introduce new courses, including lectures on calculus of variations, algebra, and the functions of mathematical physics. Bellman, however, found his attempts to teach stability theory unsuccessful, admitting that he was unprepared for the lower level of mathematical preparation among students at the time. Despite these struggles, Bellman took great pride in mentoring students. His only PhD student from Stanford, Ken Cook, wrote a thesis on differential difference equations, a topic that later became the foundation of their joint book. Bellman also guided promising students such as Howard Osborne, who had followed him from Princeton, along with Hal Royden, Joel Franklin, and Sherman Lehman, a particularly gifted undergraduate. Bellman continued to balance pure mathematics with applied problems during this period. He developed a growing interest in Siegel's theory of matrix automorphic functions, which he found both aesthetically rich and intellectually demanding. His motivation for this topic stemmed partly from his desire to learn more 19th century analysis, but it also offered fertile ground for original work. Around this time, he began writing his first book on stability theory. Initially hesitant due to the lingering memories of the controversy with Siegel at Princeton, Bellman felt compelled to proceed after his experiences at Rand. I had a very powerful analytic tool, the inequality I had discovered in Madison, and a good notation using vector and matrices, he wrote. His book emphasized the power of simple physical principles in guiding mathematical insights, reflecting his belief that mathematical rigor should be paired with physical intuition. And I quote again, Galileo remarked that mathematics is the language of science, but important clues about the behavior of equations can be obtained by observing physical processes. This is a technique that I used repeatedly ever since. It was during his summers at Rand that Bellman began to lay the foundations of dynamic programming. In 1949, he returned to the Institute and, seeking guidance on relevant research problems, he approached Ed Parkson. Parkson suggested he investigate multi-stage decision processes, a central problem to both military logistics and operational planning. This question would lead Bellman to one of his most influential contributions. Dynamic programming emerged from a need to solve complex decision-making problems where decisions unfold over multiple stages and each choice influences the next. Bellman realized that by breaking the problem into smaller, recursive subproblems, one could solve the overall challenge piece by piece. This insight was radical, not just for its mathematical depth, but also from its practicality in simplifying otherwise intractable computations. The term dynamic programming itself was crafted out of institutional necessity. Bellman later explained in his autobiography the surprising origins of the name, reflecting the political climate of the time. From his autobiography now I quote the following. The 1950s were not good years for mathematical research. Secretary of Defense Wilson had a pathological fear of the word research. His face would suffuse. He would turn red and he would get violent if people used the term. Imagine how he felt about the word mathematical. Needing a term that would sound practical rather than abstract, Bellman carefully chose dynamic programming. He elaborated, I was interested in planning, decision-making, and thinking, but planning was a problematic term. I thought, dynamic suggests time-varying systems and mathematical rigor, while programming suggests organization. No one could object to that, not even a congressman. The name was a stroke of genius, of strategic brilliance, shielding deeply theoretical work under the guise of practical, results-oriented problem solving. The mathematical core of dynamic programming emerged from Bellman's principle of optimality, which he formalized in the now famous Bellman equation. He described it as the guiding idea behind the entire framework. An optimal policy has the property that whatever the initial state and decisions are, the remaining decisions must constitute an optimal policy for the resulting state. This recursive formulation allowed complex, multi-stage decision problems to be solved systematically, providing a foundation for optimization in fields ranging from operations research to control theory. Rand's intellectual energy encouraged Bellman to develop a philosophy of problem selection that stayed with him throughout his career. He believed the best problems were not just difficult, but also revealing, capable of exposing deeper mathematical truths. Bellman says in his autobiography about problem selection the following: "This is why one analyzes a particular problem. One hopes that general principles will emerge. One gets an instinct for a good problem rather than merely a difficult one. Frequently, no general principles emerge. But this instinct is developed by seeing what great mathematicians have done in the past. Recall Abel's dictum, read the masters, not the pupils." Bellman remained defiant against conventional wisdom even when questioned by trusted friends. Henri Scheffé once urged him to abandon dynamic programming for more traditional mathematics. But Bellman refused, saying, "It is always amusing to see the rebels of one generation becoming the orthodox of the next. I vowed that this would never happen to me." In the years following World War II, Bellman found himself once again drawn into the orbit of defense research, despite his growing desire to focus solely on mathematics. In 1951, in a particularly thought-provoking episode, he received a long letter from John Wheeler, prominent Princeton physicist known for his pioneering work in nuclear physics and general relativity. The letter, as Bellman recalled, set me thinking furiously. In it, Wheeler outlined the geopolitical tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, emphasizing the need for a strong national defense amid the escalating Cold War. He argued that a thermonuclear device, the hydrogen bomb, would serve as the ultimate deterrent and ensure national security against the Soviet threat. The gravity of Wheeler's words was difficult to ignore, and though Bellman had hoped for cooperations with the Russians, the reality felt starkly different. The Cold War had begun, and the Iron Curtain had dropped. It was clear that the only thing Stalin understood was force. Only the threat of SAC bombers kept Russian troops out of Western Europe and Scandinavia, Bellman says in the autobiography. Bellman wrestled with the moral complexity of the request. His wartime contributions at Los Alamos had already left him uneasy. Though he was proud of their scientific achievement, he had never envisioned himself building weapons. Yet, Wheeler's arguments touched a nerve, saying, "I didn't want to build bombs. I thought all that was behind me with the war. Now I wanted to do mathematical research and be a university professor. However, I felt that I owed a debt to society. I knew that my brains had contributed to the war effort more than my brawn ever could." What troubled him most was the weight of responsibility he felt for protecting his country, especially when Wheeler's framed the decision in deeply human terms. Ultimately, Bellman decided to answer Wheeler's call and called to confirm his involvement. Wheeler was obviously delighted. Bellman respected him enormously, describing him as both courageous and sincere, a man with a, and I quote, "very vivid scientific imagination and several far-out ideas concerning the universe." Yet, despite his admiration, their work relationship was strained. Bellman noted, "With all that, we didn't really get along. The trouble was, he had no sense of humor." One particular source of friction was Bellman's reluctance to remain in his assigned office at Princeton Forrestal Research Center. Wheeler struggled to understand why Bellman spent so little time there. Bellman's reasoning, however, was simple. And I quote, "I prefer to spend my time in the fine old library, reading various books and doing mathematics. One of the advantages of being a mathematician is that mathematics can be done anywhere. It is not necessary to sit in an office." During this period, Bellman found intellectual inspiration beyond his defense work. He attended 2 particularly memorable lectures, each of which left a lasting impression. Bellman often liked to explore new languages, for example, Russian, Greek, Egyptian, among others, and one of these lectures was about the Etruscan language, delivered by a visiting Italian professor. The lecture presented a meticulous analysis of all known Etruscan words and the methods used to decipher them. Bellman, captivated by the intellectual puzzle, remarked, "Then and there, I decided that I would look into the decipherment of Etruscan at some later date." This actually happened in the later stages of his life. The second lecture, more technical but equally forward-looking, concerned the element germanium and its role in transistor technology. The implications were immediately clear to him. Transistors, by replacing vacuum tubes, will allow faster, smaller, and cheaper computers, a revolutionary development for the future of computation. Bellman instantly connected this to his own work. I was very pleased by this. Dynamic programming is intimately bound to computers. If computers became faster, smaller, and cheaper, dynamic programming would have many more applications. This duality, his deep moral conflict over contributing to military advancements, and his relentless drive to advance theoretical knowledge would define much of Bellman's career. While he wrestled with the responsibilities of wartime science, his mind was already envisioning a future where his mathematical ideas could drive innovation, not just in defense, but across science and technology. In the late 1940s, Bellman faced again another major career decision, whether to remain in academia at Stanford or to continue his work at the Rand Corporation. The choice was not easy. At Stanford, he held a secure tenure position with a promising career trajectory, a fine teaching load, and a pleasant home. But personal comfort and academic prestige were not the decisive factors for him. He had long dreamed of pursuing analytic number theory, a field he had been drawn to since his teenage years. However, despite his admiration for the subject, Bellman came to a sobering realization, which he notes in the autobiography as follows. I had to face the fact that I couldn't do what I wanted to do. Possibly, the state of mathematics did not allow this. Certainly, my state of knowledge was not up to it. What ultimately pulled him towards Rand was the intellectual excitement and the freedom it offered. At Rand, he saw the potential for groundbreaking work in applying mathematics, dynamic programming, control theory, and time-lag processes, all without the constraints of teaching committees or grant proposals. Bellman was captivated by the possibilities dynamic programming presented, especially its potential for practical applications. He recounts, I was intrigued by dynamic programming. It was clear to me that there was a good deal of good analysis there. Furthermore, I could see many applications. He recognized the risk of splitting his focus between theory and application, but believed he could strike a balance, saying, either I could do too much research and too little application, or too little research and too much application. I had confidence that I could do this delicate activity, pi a la mode. His decision to resign from Stanford and commit to Rand was further solidified by practical considerations. Rand's salary structure, based on a mathematician's most recent earnings, would allow him to leverage his higher Princeton pay rather than his Stanford salary, nearly doubling his income. The financial stability paired with the intellectual freedom was enough to convince him. Bellman then subsequently joins Rand in 1952. At Rand, he sets out to rigorize the foundations of dynamic programming. He noticed he was repeatedly using a similar technique for deriving functional equations and decided to formalize it as the principle of optimality, a foundational concept in optimization theory. The principle states that an optimal policy for a decision problem has the property that, regardless of the initial state and decisions, the remaining decisions must constitute an optimal policy from that point onward. However, Bellman admitted that the concept was more intuitive than mathematically rigorous at first. Oliver Gross said one day, "The principle is not rigorous," to which Bellman replied, "Of course not. It's not even precise. A good principle should guide the intuition." The theoretical challenges continued, and he delved into nonlinear functional equations, many of which defied classical analytic methods. He turned to collaborators like Erwin Krigsberg and Oliver Gross, exploring how the calculus of variations could be adapted for optimization problems. However, he found classical tools frustratingly inadequate. And I quote again, "Very simple problems required great ingenuity. A small change in the problem caused a great change in the solution. Clearly, something was wrong. There was an obvious lack of balance. Reluctantly, I was forced to the conclusion that the calculus of variations was not effective for obtaining a solution. Bellman's work extended in control theory and time lag processes with the help of John Danskin and Ken Cook. Time lag processes had fascinated Bellman since his time at Princeton, and their mathematical challenges inspired a long-term collaboration with Cook, culminating in their influential book on differential difference equations. Throughout this period, Bellman became increasingly absorbed by the mathematical structure of decision-making under constraints. He observed a key insight. The way one utilizes resources depends critically upon the level of these resources and the time remaining in the process. This realization, surprising at first, was a cornerstone for modern optimal control theory. It led him to think about decisions not just as numerical solutions, but as dynamic policies, rules that evolve over time depending on the system's state. Despite the depth of his theoretical advancements, Bellman was constantly reminded of the limitations of pure analysis without computational support. Mentioning, the challenge remained. How did one obtain the numerical solution of optimization problems? Were there reliable methods? His initial development of dynamic programming had focused on stochastic processes, but he eventually realized its broader applicability to deterministic control as well. The desired solution in a controlled process was a policy. Do thus and thus if you find yourself in this portion of the state space with this amount of time left, as he recounts. It is around this time that he coins the name curse of dimensionality, referring to a set of challenges encountered when working in high-dimensional spaces, issues that do not arise in lower-dimensional settings. In high-dimensional spaces, one of the main difficulties is that the number of dimensions increases, the volume of the space correspondingly increases exponentially, making exhaustive computation impractical. For instance, sampling a unit interval with 100 evenly spaced points provide a resolution of 0.01 between points. However, achieving a similar resolution in a 10-dimensional unit hypercube would require 10 to the 20th sample points. This phenomenon poses significant challenges in dynamic programming, where the objective is to solve complex optimization problems by breaking them down into simpler subproblems. In high-dimensional spaces, the sheer number of possible states and decisions can render traditional dynamic programming methods computationally infeasible. Bellman's identification of this issue underscored the need for innovative approaches to manage and mitigate the complexities associated with high-dimensional optimization problems. Control theory also continued to stimulate Bellman's work. One particularly influential problem came from his collaborator Joe LaSalle, the Bang control problem, which sought to restore a system to equilibrium as quickly as possible under constraints on the magnitude of controlled inputs. Bellman saw the connections between this challenge and his earlier work in stability theory, once again finding that simple constraints could introduce profound complexity in both analysis and application. This shift in thinking marked a deeper connection between dynamic programming and feedback control systems, a realization that would transform modern control theory. Ed Bellman acknowledged the difficulty of recognizing such links in real time. As he recounts in the autobiography, it's all very well to start a lecture by saying clearly a control process can be regarded as a multi-stage decision process. But it's a bit misleading. Scientific developments can always be made logical and rational with sufficient insight. It is amazing, however, how clouded the crystal ball looks beforehand. Bellman was candid about the intellectual barriers mathematicians often face, describing how the complexity of the real world tempted him to retreat to number theory. Upon first gazing upon the complexities of the real world, there is a certain temptation to return to number theory. However, problems are too difficult and victories too few. Yet, instead of retreating, he chose to engage with complexity head-on, beginning with deterministic control and expanding his focus into stochastic control theory. This framework led him towards elegant mathematical structures like the Riccati equation, though he admitted with regret that he had held back on publishing this work, hoping to reserve it for a PhD student who ultimately didn't pursue the topic. Meanwhile, others like Rudolf Kalman independently developed and published similar influential results. His intellectual journey at Rand reinforced a profound shift in his mathematical worldview. He rejected the notion that numerical computation was a lesser pursuit. Quoting again, "Like most mathematicians of my generation, I had been brought up to scorn this utilitarian activity. Numerical solution was considered the last resort of an incompetent mathematician. The opposite, of course, is true. Far more ability and sophistication is required to obtain a numerical solution than to establish the usual existence and uniqueness theorems." Bellman's belief in the importance of numerical results as the foundation for validating mathematical theory became a defining theme of his later work. Bellman recounts, "Theories stand or fall ultimately upon numbers. Thus, I became interested in computers not as electronic toys, but rather because they signified mathematically and scientifically something profound." Bellman's tenure at Rand was marked not only by his theoretical insights, but also his broader philosophical reflections on scientific progress. He recognized how historical narratives often oversimplify the messy realities of discovery. And I quote again, "We're always looking at the situation from the wrong side when events have already been frozen in time. Since we know what happened, it's not difficult to present convincing arguments to justify a particular course of events. None of these analyses must be taken too seriously, no more than Monday morning quarterbacking." Bellman's time marked not only the refinement of dynamic programming, but also his increasing influence in shaping the future of control theory. While his early work focused on mathematical structure of decision processes, his influence began expanding across collaborations with other key figures in the field. During a visit to New York, Bellman was invited to Columbia University by Merrill Flood, a prominent game theorist. There, he met two figures who would go on to become pivotal in control systems theory, namely Lofty-Zadeh and Rudolf Kalman. At the time, Kalman was focused on differential equations, a classical area of analysis. However, Bellman, the ever-visionary, saw the potential for a broader framework that extended beyond differential equations, saying, "I convinced him that control theory was the natural extension of differential equations, and he started to work in control theory. Kalman would later revolutionize the field with the Kalman filter, a breakthrough in state estimation and optimal control, deeply connected to Bellman's dynamic programming ideas." In 1957, Betty Jo suffered a ruptured disc caused by a seatbelt injury, leading them to consult multiple Los Angeles doctors without success. Frustrated, they nearly went to the Mayo Clinic before being introduced to neurosurgeon Emile Seletz. Bellman recalled being, and I quote, "quite belligerent during their first meeting, demanding a proof that the visit wouldn't be a waste of time. However, Seletz's skills and honesty quickly impressed him. Seletz, who often corrected other surgeons' mistakes, successfully operated on Betty Jo after a lengthy hospital stay. Unfortunately, not long after, a second accident occurred when a bus hit a curb, causing another ruptured disc. Once again, Dr. Seletz performed surgery, this time clipping a nerve to relieve the pain." During this difficult period, Bellman found himself not only balancing professional obligations but also domestic duties. He took on the role of a short-order cook for his children, Eric and Kirsty, preparing dinner before visiting Betty Jo in the hospital each evening. Friends like Anne Friedland and Enrique Carouche occasionally provided home cooking meals, and when energy ran low, Bellman resorted to TV dinners. His daytime support came from Ella May, who helped with breakfast and saw the children off to school. The financial strain from Betty Jo's prolonged medical treatment led Bellman to seek unconventional means of covering expenses. Drawing on his earlier experiences as a gambler, he joined a circle of professional poker players introduced by Charlie Goldstein. Bellman, leveraging his mathematical intuition and discipline, consistently outperformed the group, which consisted mostly of doctors, saying, "The easiest way to win money in Los Angeles is to play poker with doctors. It is not that these people are stupid, quite the contrary, but they had responsible jobs during the day requiring utmost concentration. Consequently, when they played cards, they relaxed and gambled in a reckless fashion. He emphasized that his success didn't come from complex game theory, but simple, consistent poker, and quote-unquote. Though his opponents remained convinced that he was using advanced mathematical strategies to outsmart them. By 1962, the strain in Richard Bellman's marriage had reached a breaking point. Bellman made the difficult decision to leave the household despite knowing the emotional impact it would have on the children, saying, "I realized that Betty Jo and I were not good for each other. I knew this action would hurt Eric and Kirsty. As a matter of fact, the reason I had delayed leaving the house was because of Betty Jo's accident and because of the children. However, I felt the best example I could set was that each person should live his own life. I didn't think they would be grateful later if I said that I had sacrificed my life for them." Returning to bachelor life after over 2 decades was a significant adjustment for Bellman. He appreciated the newfound freedom to come and go as he pleased, but also encountered unexpected challenges. Cooking and shopping came naturally, but social life was a bit more complicated. It was all right to flirt when I was married, but when I was single, girls took it seriously, he noted with humor in his autobiography. Weekends arrived quickly, and without planned dates, he faced moments of loneliness. He filled his free time with chess, rigorously improving his game by replaying famous matches and practicing openings late into the night. His efforts paid off when he managed to secure a draw against the chess grandmaster Roshevsky during a simultaneous exhibition match against 60 players. Bellman recounted, and I quote again, "I actually had won a game, but when he offered the draw, I was so overjoyed I accepted immediately." In June 1961, Bellman first noticed Nina, a striking young woman he initially believed to be involved with his colleague Stuart Dreyfus. When he later discovered this wasn't the case, he found an opportunity to get to know her. Their relationship seemed destined to remain casual. Nina was planning to join the Peace Corps and no interest in marriage. Additionally, the 18-year age gap and vocal opposition from Nina's family, including her best friend Mary Jane and her mother, made the relationship seem temporary. On my part, Bellman recalled, I had no desire to get involved since I was still emotionally upset. After all, one does not break up a 21-year-old marriage easily. Naturally, we fell in love. Bellman admired Nina's classical beauty, playfully comparing her to Botticelli's Venus on the Half Shell and noting her resemblance to Alice in the famous illustrations of Alice in Wonderland. Their relationship was built on shared intellectual interests, ranging from archaeology and classical history to jazz. Bellman was especially charmed by her knowledge of Latin and music. Though she lacked his fondness of Dixieland, Nina introduced him to modern jazz groups like the Modern Jazz Quartet, which Bellman jokingly referred to as courting music. Nina's heritage fascinated him as well. A native Californian and a 10th-generation American, she proudly traced her ancestry back to Pocahontas. She often enjoyed sharing this connection at social gatherings, claiming she was part Indian. Their relationship deepened, and after Bellman's divorce from Betty Jo was finalized, he and Nina married, beginning a new chapter of his life filled with both personal healing and intellectual companionship. Despite his lack of involvement in any subversive activity, Richard's career and personal life were affected by Cold War paranoia and the rise of McCarthyism. In 1954, while browsing the headlines of Stanford's bookstore, Bellman noticed a striking story about the arrest of Army Sergeant David Greenglass for espionage. Greenglass had passed secret documents from Klaus Fuchs, a physicist at Los Alamos, to his wife, who then relayed them to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in New York. What caught Bellman's attention was not just this scandal, but his personal connections to the event. Years earlier, during World War II, Bellman had reluctantly allowed Greenglass and his wife to stay in his vacant Albuquerque apartment when his wife, Betty Jo, was away from training. He had only agreed after pressure from colleagues who accused him of being anti-Semitic for refusing. However, when the Greenglasses overstayed their welcome, Bellman firmly asked them to leave, ending the association. When the Greenglass espionage case made the headlines, Bellman was questioned by the FBI. The agents, one from Harvard and the other from CCNY, directly confronted him. Do you know that Greenglass named you as a candidate for Soviet espionage? Bellman, unshaken, recounted his limited interaction with Greenglass and was supported by colleagues from Los Alamos who confirmed his anti-communist views and minimal association with Greenglass. The FBI ultimately concluded there was no case against him, and his security clearance at Rand remained unaffected. However, the climate shifted drastically during the McCarthy era. Senator McCarthy unleashed a campaign of fear targeting intellectual scientists and government employees under suspicion of communist ties, often with minimal evidence. Bellman saw firsthand how the culture of fear stifled intellectual freedom and deterred people from working on government projects, particularly those involved in classified research. In 1954, the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, sent Bellman a letter revisiting the Greenglass incident, mentioning also that Bestie Joe's younger brother had briefly associated with communist groups, even though he had only been 13 at the time of their marriage. This reopened investigation forced Bellman to face the same accusations despite having already been cleared. Some colleagues at Rand avoided him, while others supported him openly, a division he remembered very clearly. Bellman resolved not to retreat from his position, though some suggested he could avoid the controversy by returning to academia. He refused to let fear dictate his decision, stating, "In the first place, I'm not prudent. In the second place, I was innocent." He sold his house on Bundy Drive, ensuring we do not appear financially vulnerable, and secured potential university positions, including an offer from UCLA and support from Richard Curran and NYU, both of whom expressed solidarity with him. When the hearings finally took place, the board dismissed the Greenglass matter as fully investigated but probed into his association with his brother-in-law. Bellman explained that he had distanced himself from Robert Cates as soon as it became clear he had held radical views. Ironically, Cates later renounced those beliefs, returned to school, and he became a respected geographer, even being elected at the National Academy of Sciences. Bellman's defense was strengthened by personal testimonials from colleagues and friends, including mathematicians Peter Lax, Ted Harris, and Herb Bailey. Their letters and testimonies painted a clear picture of Bellman's long-standing anti-communist stance. The hearing ended on a positive note, and the local AEC office in San Francisco was prepared to clear him. However, just before finalizing their decision, the case was transferred to Albuquerque, where officials reversed the decision and upheld the initial charges. Despite this setback, Bellman appealed the ruling. To his surprise, while attending a mathematics conference in Laramie, Wyoming, he received word that his appeal had been granted and his security clearance reinstated. He returned triumphantly to Los Alamos, where he participated in a tennis tournament, finding humor in the unique challenges of playing at high altitude, where even a bounce could send the ball flying over the fence. Bellman's personal struggles during his period were not unique. Several other Rand employees faced similar accusations. His colleague Herman Kahn, an equally staunch anti-communist, faced scrutiny due to political affiliations of his wife's family. Though Kahn was ultimately cleared, the experience left lasting emotional scars on Bellman. The absurdity of the era reached even more bizarre heights when a colleague was accused of attending communist meetings, only for it to be revealed that he had gone to impress a romantic interest who insisted he attend. Even years later, in 1964, Bellman was contacted again by the Air Force for further questioning. Refusing to be drawn into another round of baseless accusations, he demanded all questions in writing, knowing it was a clear case of double jeopardy. His firm stance was effective. He never heard back from them. In the early 1965, Richard Bellman faced another important career decision. At Rand, he enjoyed extraordinary freedom to pursue foundational work in dynamic programming and control theory alongside some of the brightest minds of his generation, including Stuart Dreyfus, Bob Calaba, and Masanao Aoki. He also had a generous salary, a private secretary, unlimited travel budget, and no teaching duty. Yet, something fundamental was missing. Despite the intellectual richness at Rand, Bellman increasingly felt the absence of a formal role in mentoring young mathematicians. "I had complete freedom, but it wasn't clear how long it would last," he reflected. Though he already helped several researchers, including Dreyfus and Aoki, earn their PhDs, he realized he wanted to train students more systematically. There had been talk of transforming Rand into a university, but the idea never materialized. If he was going to shape the next generation of scholars, he needed to be in academia. At the same time, Rand's atmosphere was shifting. The freedom that had defined his early years there seemed to be increasingly fragile. The intellectual climate at Rand had changed, he noted. The sense of pursuing research for its own sake was giving way to a more results-driven focus. Initially, Bellman considered UCLA, where he had personal ties and professional collaborations. But the constraints of a large public university felt stifling after years of total autonomy. I had been used to living a very unconstrained life, he explained, and the idea of putting myself into a cage did not seem to be attractive. USC, the University of Southern California, however, presented an unexpected opportunity. Through his friends Al Whiteman, Bellman met Zohab Kaplan, the chair of electrical engineering, a shrewd administrator known for his cutting through bureaucracy. Kaplan introduced him to Roger Egeberg, the influential dean of the medical school and former physician to General MacArthur. Egeberg, known for his directness and pragmatism, quickly saw Bellman's potential. Bellman described the meeting vividly with Egeberg. Egeberg talked to me for a while and then commented, "You'll solve all of our problems in a year." I replied, "It'll take me 2 years." When Egeberg asked about salary expectations, Bellman suggested $25,000, a bold figure for the time, but one the medical school could justify given the scale of his proposed work. The deal was closed without committee approvals. Bellman recounts, Egeberg laughed and said that the committees would agree to anything he thought was right. Once at USC, Bellman wasted no time. His first goal was to introduce computers into hospital operations, but he approached the challenge cautiously, having learned that from IBM's earlier failed attempt to automate entire hospital systems at once. The hospital is the last vestige of feudalism, he observed, pointing out how each department head acted like a, and I quote, a feudal baron, making full cooperation nearly impossible. Instead, he focused on incremental steps tailored to specific medical needs, working with figures like cardiologist Roger Jelliffe on dosage models for heart medications. These collaborations led him to fascinating mathematical questions. His work with Jelliffe on compartmental models for drug dosage, simple mathematical models representing drug distribution in the body, drew him deeper into biological modeling. Bellman also interacted with Lofty-Zadeh, the pioneer of fuzzy logic, as mentioned also earlier, and Carl Ostrom, a leading figure in control theory today. Zadeh's work on fuzzy systems in particular fascinated Bellman because it extended the reach of mathematics from the purely physical to the social and biological sciences. Fuzzy systems and computer simulation, he noted, can allow us to study and model many processes beyond the inanimate, into areas of behavior and decision-making. Bellman remained deeply interested in the structure of decision-making under constraints. As he reflected, the way one utilizes resources depends critically upon the level of those resources and the time remaining in the process. Yet, his decision to leave Rand was not just about academic mentorship or intellectual freedom. It was also philosophical. At Rand, he had seen how the culture of defense research shaped priorities. Moving to USC allowed him to return to a broader scientific mission, one grounded not only in pure theory but in the service of society. This is why one analyzes a particular problem, he writes. One hopes that general principles will emerge, one gets an instinct for a good problem rather than merely a difficult one. In 1962, Richard Bellman visited for the first time the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, known simply as the Center. His visit was marked by historical tragedy, the assassination of President Kennedy. His scheduled lecture went on despite the shocking news, though Bellman admitted, "I have no memory of what I talked about, nor did Brownlee Haydon, who was there that day, and I'm sure that the audience has no memory either. We were all busy speculating on the consequences and whether the assassin belonged to the extreme right or the extreme left." Bellman visited the center because he admired the stance of the center against McCarthyism, recalling how its leader, Robert Hutchins, had been one of the few public figures to challenge Senator McCarthy's witch hunts. Yet, he remained hesitant to get involved. I admired the center, he reflected, but there were too many people there whose ideas I didn't like. Among them was Ping Ferry, whom Bellman respected personally but clashed with philosophically. Still, Bellman couldn't resist his dry wit, recalling a moment when Ferry once said, "I listen to the prophets." To which Bellman replied, "Ping, I listen to the non-prophets." By 1969, the center was undergoing a reorganization, and Bellman saw an opening. With controversial figures like Ferry gone, he wrote to Hutchins expressing interest in contributing. Hutchins responded positively, inviting Bellman to a conference focused on redefining the center's mission, and attendees included prominent intellectuals such as Kenneth Boulding, Bertrand de Juvenal, and Alexander King. Bellman suggested a focus on studying the mathematical structure of societal systems, saying, "It is clear that such a study is needed. The mathematician has much to offer to the study of our culture: what systems exist, what control mechanisms operate, and what data are available to decision makers." The invitation led to Bellman becoming formally associated with the center, where he continued to explore the application of mathematical models to complex social issues. He was particularly concerned with global sustainability and food security, reflecting on global consumption patterns. For example, he notes, "An analysis of beef shows that it is uneconomic, certainly in a hungry world. It takes about 8 pounds of cereal to produce 1 pound of beef." Bellman argued for the need to shift dietary habits, even suggesting, "We will have to start eating insects, as is done in many parts of the world. One advantage of this is that it will automatically act as pest control." His critiques extended beyond food systems. He was skeptical of the so-called, quote-unquote, Green Revolution, which aimed to boost agricultural yields, but in his view, merely postponed deeper issues of overpopulation and crop vulnerability, saying, "The new crops were not stable, leaving the native population open to starvation." At the center, Bellman also contributed to debates on scientific accountability. He collaborated with Harvey Wheeler on Constitutionalization of Science project, which sought to address how scientific projects could be responsibly guided. Wheeler encouraged critical reviews of Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity, a work Bellman found flawed from its oversimplification of human behavior. His own critique, titled Pigeons on the Grass, alas, challenged Skinner's reliance on an outdated black box model of behavior, cautioning that such oversimplified frameworks were dangerous when applied to complex societal systems. A model of psychology which Skinner constructed was a good one about 50 years ago, he noted. But with the increase in knowledge of the components of the quote-unquote black box, a sophisticated model should be used. Richard Bellman's final years were marked by profound physical challenges and unwavering intellectual strength. After a lifetime of groundbreaking mathematical contributions, he faced severe health complications that left him physically incapacitated yet mentally sharp. There is a wonderful documentary on YouTube titled The Mysterious Man Behind the Bellman Equation. This is a deeply personal account produced by his grandson about Bellman and the relationship that his grandson had with Eric, the first son of Richard Bellman. Strongly recommended. I'll put a link in the description. In this documentary, his grandson reflects, "I knew him as a man in a wheelchair. All I knew was that he made weird noises I couldn't understand and dragged himself around this gigantic mansion." First, a severe medical crisis nearly ended Richard Bellman's life. Diagnosed with a tumor the size of an egg, his doctors had to choose between waiting for his heart to recover or removing the tumor immediately, at a greater risk. In this documentary that I referred to before, the family of Richard Bellman says, there was no choice. They had to go for it. The surgery was marked by complications. He suffered a stroke, a heart attack, and meningitis during the operation, yet miraculously survived. His grandson described how Bellman, despite these immense challenges, fought to rebuild his body. He was completely paralyzed, but he was like, wherever he could get to move, he was starting to practice. Though he never walked again unaided, he gained enough strength to swim, holding onto rails, and maintain a muscular physique despite his condition. Throughout this period, his mind remained sharp. Unable to speak for a time, he kept his mind active by composing an entire book in his head, memorizing it page by page until he could write it down. His grandson remembers, the moment he could talk, he started with page 1, chapter 1. Even when reduced to minimal physical movement, Bellman continued working. He didn't plan on dying, his grandson observes. He would swim 100 laps and worked out on the track with a harness, building up his muscles. He did that for 10 years. Yet, the toll on his life's passion was evident. Chess, a one-shared love between him and his son, Eric, slipped from his grasp, with Eric saying, "I got to the point where I was winning 1 out of 3 games against him, which was no small feat. But after his health declined, he could no longer concentrate, and eventually we stopped playing." Richard Bellman passed away on March 19, 1984, in Los Angeles after a heart attack. His daughter Christy described seeing a rare sense of peace on his face, saying, "He was lying there and his face looked beautiful. That driven person, his body no longer driven. He hadn't looked that peaceful any time I'd ever seen him." Bellman's final movements were marked not by the relentless energy of his working years, but by a calmness that perhaps, after so much struggle, felt like release. Dynamic programming was just one chapter in Richard Bellman's extraordinary life. His influence on modern artificial intelligence and machine learning cannot be understated. For example, the Bellman equation remains central to Markov decision processes, also known as MDPs, a cornerstone of reinforcement learning, with modern AI systems like AlphaGo and OpenAI's language models tracing their foundations back to this work. Like many visionaries, Bellman faced skepticism. Early critics dismissed dynamic programming as computationally impractical, yet he remained undeterred, emphasizing that mathematics is just about proving theorems. It's about solving problems. Theorems are just the tracks left behind by the train of thought. Despite working with primitive computers in the 50s, Bellman foresaw a future where computing power would catch up with his ideas. Limitations breed creativity, he often remarked. Time has proven him right, as dynamic programming now plays a central role in fields from robotics and logistics to modern AI. To truly understand Bellman's life and contributions, I highly recommend reading his autobiography, Eye of the Hurricane, which I have quoted extensively in this episode. I also recommend watching The Mysterious Man Behind the Bellman Equation, the YouTube documentary that I also mentioned before, produced by his grandson. Both offer rare insights into his personal reflections, intellectual resilience, and profound impact across disciplines. Bellman himself described why sharing personal stories matters in his preface, which I will use to close this episode. Why write an autobiography? In the first place, I've been in interesting places at interesting times. New York City, Princeton, Los Alamos, Rand, and the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, to name a few. I think others will be interested to get a glimpse of these places through my eyes. In the second place, I have always found personal essays, biographies, and autobiographies very valuable. Reading about the inertia, stupidity, and prejudice faced by others has made me more philosophical. It is very important to know that others have had the same troubles. I hope that this account will also be useful. Finally, there is the opportunity to speak freely. In writing a mathematical paper, one tries to be rigidly impersonal. In writing an autobiography, one has the chance to explain and express opinions. Besides, it is very interesting to see if one can discern a pattern and to know how large a role chance played in one's life. This closes the episode on Richard Bellman, another giant in the history of control theory. Thank you for listening. I hope you liked the show today. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, follow us on Spotify, support on Patreon or PayPal, and connect with us on social media platforms. See you next time.